Hello and welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Coverage Journal. Today's sponsor is Avalution, and the topic is how to focus and simplify your business continuity program. Before we get started, I wanted to review a couple housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. The recording will be shared with everyone tomorrow via an automated email. Attendees are also in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask questions, please use the question panel you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer as many of these as possible at the end of the session. Now back to today's topic on how to focus and simplify your business continuity program. Our presenter today is Rob Giffen with Avalution. Rob is a co-founder, managing director, and the president of Avalution Consulting, the creators of Business Continuity Operating System and Catalyst Business Continuity Software. Over his career, Rob has been involved in business continuity consulting at all levels. This includes consulting for hundreds of clients, building multiple continuity and information security tools, and participating in a wide range of industry groups and forums, such as the DRJ's Editorial Advisory Board. With no further words, and I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to Rob.
Great, thank you, Bob. And thanks to all of you for joining this afternoon or this morning if you're out on the West Coast to spend a little bit of time looking at ways to focus and simplify your business continuity program. I want to start, I appreciate the introduction, Bob. I want to start as well, just kind of taking a step back, kind of explaining where I come from, and then we'll very quickly move into kind of the meat of the matter here. So to start, as Bob mentioned, I started Avalution with a partner of mine almost 14 years ago. And the reason I'm here, the reason I'm in the business continuity space at its core is I just really love solving problems. I like to kind of encounter new problems and find ways to solve them. And, over the years, both my business partner and I have found business continuity to just be a fascinating set of problems that organizations face and at times really struggle with. And so we've built a firm, Avalution, as a firm of people that are just focused on helping find success in business continuity. And that's what we've been doing for the last 14 years. And we've worked with, as Bob mentioned, hundreds of different companies to be able to build out business continuity programs. And so it's with that experience, I just want you to have kind of that sense of kind of where we come from to be able to speak to some of these topics that we've kind of seen kind of pattern themselves over time with different clients that we've worked with. And so one of the things that we love to do is kind of look at that pattern of kind of where folks struggled or what are the most kind of common areas of improvement and kind of target like, okay, well, what are some of the things that we can do to make sure that that doesn't happen? So that's where we come from. What Avalution is just a combination of, we do consulting and software, and Catalyst is our software product, and our consulting side does all kinds of everything you might ever need, assessments and facilitation and things like that. So that's who we are, but mostly I want to talk today about what you all had to say. So when we had folks sign up for this webinar, we asked you, what's the biggest thing that you're struggling with your business continuity program? It might have been a while since you signed up, but trust me, many of you submitted answers to that. And a lot of them found their way kind of down into this kind of core list of things. So I kind of summarized it here. So some of you are just saying like, hey, I got a problem with everything being critical. Maybe not everything, but a lot of things. 60% is a lot of critical things. Some of you were saying like, I'm stuck kind of with the analysis and stuck trying to get past some of like the in the weeds types of conversations that the analysis or the BIA kind of leads to. Some of you said you're just drowning in plans, like I got way too many plans, and so it's difficult to kind of drive things. Some of you said that the challenge is like buy-in, might be executive buy-in, might be buy-in with the different departments that you're working with, or the coordinators that you have. But all of you kind of expressed like at some level of kind of like hitting the wall and like having to kind of battle through, whatever the thing is, whether it's being critical or, having too many plans, and that becomes kind of the thing that you keep kind of battling against. And so one, I really appreciate the feedback and the observation. And this is exactly why, I would say almost, 80 or 90% of the comments that we received in the initial question really aligns very tightly to the idea of focusing and simplifying. So if these kind of resonate with you as problems that could help improve your program, could help improve the work that you do, then you're at the right place. This is what we're going to talk about today, and I'm really excited to talk about it because what I found is that this is like, this changes everything, honestly. For people that really apply it well, this makes everything better, and so I'm excited to share that with you. So what are we going to talk about today? So the title of the presentation is Focus and Simplify. And so we're going to work on what you can do to focus and simplify your program. And the way that we're going to do it is with two things. First of all, a process that we call frame. And basically what frame is call it a scoping exercise, but it's the thing that you do at the beginning. And it helps get clarity about a variety of things that are going on in your program. And at a different level, what frame really is a conversation. It's a conversation with the executives that are ultimately accountable for the continuity of the organization. So normally it's about a 90-minute discussion, just to give you kind of like that concrete view of it. So we're going to talk about frame and what's involved in it and how you can apply that. And then and frame is the tool, by the way, for focus, right? So frame as a scoping tool helps you focus in on the most important things. And then once you have focus, then you can simplify. It's quite difficult to simplify before you have focus because you're kind of flying blind at that point. So the second part of the presentation, we'll talk about how to simplify by applying what you gather in the frame process throughout the rest of the organization. So that's kind of the two sides of the presentation today. So I'll start with frame and then we'll come back to simplifying. So what frame is, I said frame is a discussion. Frame is the thing that you do at the beginning. Frame is really, it's just 4 questions. And so we've found that if we get clear about these 4 questions and that everybody involved in the business continuity program has the same answers to these 4 questions, then it is smooth sailing through the rest of the program. And so the questions are quite simply, why are we doing business continuity? What exactly are we trying to protect? How much business continuity do we need? And who should be involved? And I don't know, if you're a skeptical type like I am, you might think to yourself, well, those are pretty obvious questions, Rob. And you're absolutely right. They are kind of obvious questions. But what we have found, many years ago, we took the risk of taking these obvious questions and putting them in front of a steering committee at one of our clients and asking the obvious question to the steering committee. And here's what we found. They had an incredible conversation about it. That even the people in the room weren't really on the same page about these topics. And if they can't even agree on it, how can we, and how can we implement around it? And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is how you can take these 4 obvious questions and do some real magic with it inside of about 90 minutes with your executive team, and what that looks like, and what the process that we found to actually kind of really effectively achieve reliable results across our different client base with using these 4 questions. So what does if we were to think of frame as a discussion or a process, what does it look like? Well, there's some prep ahead of time that you want to do. There's then facilitating the discussion, and then there's documenting the outcomes and what you do with it. And so we'll kind of step through each of these different things. As I mentioned, frame is really at its core a discussion. And so you need, in terms of the people that are involved, you want somebody that's going to facilitate the discussion. And that person is going to have to be in charge of the preparation. And then the participants, we typically advise people that, if you've got a business continuity steering committee, great. But you want to make sure, some people have business continuity steering committees that are at different levels. Some are like really senior executives, some are kind of more the operational level. We find that, one, not surprisingly, the higher up you go, the better the conversation becomes, because you can find people that can look across the organization. They don't just look at their silo. And that ultimately, the right people for this conversation are decision makers, people that can commit the organization, and that they tend to be somewhere in the operational space. So like somebody from either the COO or somebody similar, the CFO or somebody similar, the CIO or somebody similar. Those are kind of like the three core. And then sometimes you get into like, sometimes audit might be involved, or like other folks that are, let's call them, just have a major face on the business, right? So like they might be more on the sales and marketing side, but they're kind of the commercial side of the product. Sometimes those people will get involved as well. But the CIO, COO, and CFO, I'm not saying that it has to be those people, but people, if it's under those people, then somebody that can commit the organization. These are great people to bring to this meeting. But ultimately, in terms of participation, you want to have, somewhere between 6 and 10, no more than 10. Ideally closer to 6. If you can get the coverage that you needed with 6, stick with 6. Because as I said, it's a conversation. And I'll tell you this much, you can't have a good conversation with 16 people or 20 people. It will not work, and you'll never be able to get through it in a reasonable amount of time. So we want to keep the group small. And then finally, you want to have somebody that can take notes and be a summarizer. I'll tell you that I tend to just take notes as I facilitate. I tend to be the facilitator and the note taker. But the key with the note taker is not just somebody that's going to sit in the room and write down everything that you say. It's somebody that can sit in the room and synthesize what you say, or even better, display it to everybody in the room. Because I'll show you what it looks like to kind of, rather than trying to listen to what people say and write it all down afterwards and then send it all out for review, what works a lot better is to write it down as people talk, and they can see it as it's written, and then they can agree or disagree with it right in the moment and move on. And that eliminates a review and feedback cycle. It just requires a good note taker to be able to only take down the things that are important, show them on the screen, make sure everyone's good. So that's the third role that's involved in that. So that's the people and who we typically involve in it. When we get to the preparation, here are some things that we suggest in terms of preparing. First of all, one of the most important things you can do is do a dry run with a core team. And so a core team, if you've got a team of people, like if you're the program manager and then you've got a couple of people that work for you, doing it with them. If you've got kind of like a core business continuity group of like advisors, like kind of power business continuity coordinators, sit down with 2 of them and do a dry run. But walking through the whole presentation and literally presenting it to them, not like the way that you would review something where you go like, okay, here's where I'm going to talk about preparing. No, like actually literally presenting it to them and getting their input on each of the questions. This has 2 benefits. One, it prepares you, it gives you a test run. And then 2, it pre-populates some of the answers so that the executives have something to react to. And if yours is the type of organization where the executives don't like being shown a blank sheet of paper and asked to fill it out, then this might, which tends to be most, by the way, this helps kind of spur the discussion. The key with the dry run though is to intentionally not try and make it perfect. Like the worst thing that could happen is you've got all the answers and you present it and there's no discussion at this thing. It's just the executives all nodding and saying, yeah, you've got it. Like I would quite literally intentionally make it not quite good enough, have some unknowns that you want to sort out with the executives, because the intention is discussion. The intention isn't sign off, the intention is engagement and discussion. And so if you get them talking, then you're moving the ball forward in that regard. One of the things you're going to want to do is research the products and services. It's critical that you understand kind of the way that the business works. That might be obvious to some of you that do business continuity, that you understand the way the business works, but if you don't, you got to have a good sense of that, so do some research there. Same thing with obligations or expectations that exist. Getting into those, again, might be obvious, but you want to understand those things before you walk into this conversation. And then finally, how customers use our products and services, the things that you produce. Spending some time to think about and understand how customers are really using them also is a great perspective to be able to bring to the discussion. So that's kind of the preparation side, and that varies, but it's always better to kind of be a little bit over prepared and have kind of dug into some of these things, to be able to add to the conversation. I will tell you though that there isn't much risk in under preparing, because at its worst you're a facilitator, right? And so you can gather this information from that core team. So that's the background, who to be involved, how to prepare, all those types of things. Let's talk about these 4 questions, these 4 obvious questions, and what does it look like to actually ask them and to what do the answers look like? What do good answers look like is probably the most important thing. And what does that kind of process unfold as? So I'm going to start with the first question. Why do we need business continuity? So the key here, the point of this conversation is ultimately to get them to sell themselves on the need for your program. I see a lot of presentations that talk about selling business continuity to executives, and quite frankly, I don't think that's a great idea. At least I haven't seen it work terribly effectively. First of all, executives are executives for a reason, and they're experts at being sold to. Like, they know when they're getting sold something, and they tend to, kind of get defensive about that. When we ask why do we need business continuity, first of all, it's kind of an obvious question, but the point of it is for them to justify to themselves, to each other, why this is important. And our only goal here is to make sure that everyone's on the same page, that it is in fact important. So you don't need some precise answer. You don't need like a perfect bulleted list, although I tend to just kind of write a sentence or two or a bulleted list about what the answers are. There's some sub questions on the screen, like what are your drivers, and what do your stakeholders expect, that help kind of drive it. But this is the first point where, like, for those of you that facilitate exercises, it's similar to an exercise. At some point during an exercise, you've got to stop talking and wait for somebody else to. And this is the first point where you have to do that. You have to pose the question, why do we need business continuity? I would like to understand your perspectives, you gathered in the room perspectives. Tell me your thoughts on this, and then you have to wait and live through the silence that accompanies that until somebody finally speaks up. And if you can get over that wait of kind of living through that silence, what you're likely to hear is some kind of a pretty good answer as to why business continuity is needed. And then shortly after that, you might have to wait through another kind of endless silence as well. Somebody else saying something different, or adding to the first person. And then you're on a roll. And so ultimately, the goal here is to get them in their own words to kind of speak out why this thing is important, you to capture it. And the most important thing that you can be on the lookout for is somebody that isn't nodding or seems to be kind of passively disagreeing, because that's the person that you want to call on, before this question is over, to make sure that they are either in agreement with what's being said or not in agreement. The biggest fallacy with all these questions in this whole presentation is that we're trying to collect this information for our use in the business continuity program, and that's not true. The purpose of the conversation is so that we all have the same answer, like so that we're all on the same page. And so if the CIO is like, yeah, but really, come on, is it that big of a deal? This is why you want to have the conversation, and you want it in front of the other executives so that they can convince the CIO that it's important and you don't have to. It's their conversation. And so that's the whole point of question one, is everyone getting on the same page and to kind of energize the discussion. Like I sit through these question one discussions, and by the end, people are typically like, yeah, this is actually super important. Like, it's actually exactly tied to our core mission. Like, if we don't have this working, we have a big problem with achieving our core mission. Like, when people get to that point and they're saying it themselves, not you saying it, oh man, the whole rest, everything else goes better for really, quite frankly, the rest of the year. Everyone's engaged. And you can do that by not selling to them, letting them identify. So that's the whole point in question one. And once it's energized to that level, once we've got it kind of like all down, I just kind of zoom ahead to question two at that point. That's the whole goal here. And secondly, to make sure that nobody is kind of disagreeing or kind of passively disagreeing. So that's the idea with question one. Then we move to question two, and it gets a little bit more interesting. What are we trying to protect? So this is a pretty ambiguous question, but it's got some very specific answers that you want to look for. And at this point, we start to teach people that every business produces products and services. So we teach the concept of products and services to the executives at this point. So every business produces products and services, and we can name those products and services. And the question that we want to answer is, which of these products and services that we produce externally are so important to you that you need to protect them with a business continuity program? And that is sometimes informed by like your organization, your strategy, might be by revenue, might be customer or client regulatory requirements. Like it could be any of those things. But our goal here is to identify a list. And I will tell you, most organizations have a list between 10 and 15 of these critical products and services that they want to protect. And so if you're thinking to yourself at this point, well, Rob, we're blank, we're a manufacturer and we make 5,000 different products. So how is that going to work for us? I understand what you're saying, but it's time to get creative. Like it doesn't have to be 5,000 like literal products. It's like, what are the groupings? What are the logical groupings? What are the product families? What's really important? And can we synthesize that down? And so I've got some examples for you to kind of spur the imagination a little bit. So here's two sets of examples. On the left is one company, on the right is another company. So you can read each column kind of independently, top to bottom, and you'll, I think, probably pretty quickly be able to imagine what type of company that we're talking about. So on the left is a hospital, and this hospital has, let's count them, 8 products and services that they've identified as critical. This is a major metropolitan hospital. They've got, thousands of employees, but their executives can boil what is most important to them down into these 8 products and services. And you can see there's a few things about all of these that are important to note. The first one is that they're all actions. So when you produce a product or service, it's an action, and you want to title your products and services as actions. So protect and help employees and residents is an action. Provide trauma services, action. Call center is not exactly an action, but triage and scheduling are a little bit more so. Send health records out, provide them, those are all action words. They start with actions. And that's super important because actions allow you to kind of get focused. If you just say, excuse me, if you just say finance, you're never going to be able to use that as a tool to be able to focus your program, because what you've just done is include in the scope of your program an entire department. And what you need to do is ask yourself is, what is so important about finance? And so in this hospital's case, the answer is they need to bill patients and collect. Great. Now I can, as we get further down this road, I don't have to scope in the entire finance department. I just have to scope in the people that are responsible for billing patients and collecting money. And, in some cases that might not save you a lot. In other cases, that might save you half the department that you don't have to worry about as much. So this is the idea, products and services that are needed. And also the other thing to note here is that, this could be any hospital, quite frankly. And the one on the right is an insurance company. It's like a life type insurance company. And it could be any life insurance company. It might be different if it was like a, slightly different type of insurance company. But they're pretty generic, and that's totally okay. Be generic. The one I don't have here is like a manufacturing example where they get grouped into, typically they get grouped into either product families or kind of critical capabilities. So like some manufacturers, what's most important to them is that they kind of keep some of their sub-assemblies running. So, keeping sub-assemblies going. It's also worth noting that question 3 is going to assign timeframes to all of these. So you want to keep that in mind too. So you can see up here on the top where it says perform voice customer service. Originally with this client, we had provide customer service as the product and service. And then we went and did a business impact analysis, and we realized that basically to really provide the full customer service capability, they've got some systems that they can't recover. And so then we figured out, we went back to steering committee and said, okay, well, you said provide customer service is super critical, but you got these systems that you can't recover. And so what do you want to do? We can either spend $3 million to fix the systems, or we can change the expectation. And if you're okay with waiting on the systems for 3 days, they couldn't, I guess, can't recover is probably the wrong term. They couldn't recover them fast enough. They could recover them after a few days. So the choice became for the steering committee, would you like to change your answer on what's most critical, or would you like to invest to be able to make it real? And by the way, what a great conversation, right? So like when you can pose that question to people, now they've got something to dig into. But in their case, they said, yeah, we're good on the 3 million. Let's just make it perform voice customer service. So like somebody can answer the phone. They can't do anything once they answer the phone other than say, I'm sorry, or maybe answer some basic questions. But the executive sat around the table and said, actually, we're okay with that. We're going to save the 3 million. We're going to accept that if we have a disaster, it's going to be a day or two of answering phones and apologizing. And then within 3 days, we'll have the systems back. Those are the types of conversations that you can get into if you drive this at the product and service level, and get out of some of the other conversations that you get stuck in, kind of down in all the super details. So those are the two things. They're eventually going to get timeframes, and so you want to scope them in a way that makes sense for timeframes, and that too, they need to be actions so that you can kind of laser focus on just the action and not have to worry about the whole department. And so again, as I said, when you do your dry run, what I typically do is I just start this list with whatever that core team is I'm doing a dry run with. Like, guys, give me your answers. What do you think? And I intentionally make sure that it's not good enough, like that it's like missing some things, or that I've got some questions in my head that I need to sort out, so that I can put it up on the screen with the executives and be like, okay, here's what I'm thinking about products and services that are important to us. Sometimes I have no idea, and I just start with pay employees because that's a universal one. Every organization ever has a critical product or service for paying employees. And that's, you might call that not a real product or service because it's not going to customers, it's going to employees, but I don't know what to tell you. I guess it's the one that breaks the rules, but for us, pay employees is the universal one. And it's the easiest one for everyone to get around. Like, yeah, we want to make sure we can pay our employees. So we'll put that on the list. That's a good starting point. What else? So you want to have that conversation, and you might spend a good portion of the whole time just having this conversation about what are the critical products and services, and that's okay, because the rest of it will go relatively fast. So that's products and services, and getting these down and getting them to a list. And if the list is 15 or 20, that's okay, but at times I have steering committees that come up with what I think are clearly terrible products and services, but I just leave them on there because they'll get sorted out in the next question. So don't worry about the quality of the products and services that the steering committee comes up with. If they're good with it, just roll with it. It'll all get sorted out in the end. So let's move the piece. By the way, just a facilitation note as you're doing this, I'm showing you examples, but as you're actually having the conversation, what you can do is just kind of add a white sheet, add a blank PowerPoint slide, or go to the whiteboard and just write them down. And so as people say them, write them down, and you can actually fine tune the wording and everything. And so as I was saying, if you can show people what the answers are that they're coming up with as you go, they can buy into them immediately, and there's no need to like summarize it later, make sure everyone actually is talking about the same thing. You can do that all in the real time. Okay, so question 2, answered. Got a list of products and services, and that is what we're trying to protect. That's why we, it's the why in terms of what we're trying to protect and build the business continuity program around. So then 3, and people, this is like kind of the curveball. So then 3 is how much business continuity do we need? And this is where we're going to assign timeframes to that list that you came up with in question 2. So now you've got a list of products and services, and now we're going to assign some timeframes to this. And so a few things that we do to simplify the process of assigning timeframes, because if I were to just give you a blank sheet of paper and give you the products and services and ask you with a group of 6 people to assign timeframes, it's very easy to get stuck in the weeds of like, well, is it 0 hours or is it 1 hour? Can we live with any downtime? All that kind of stuff. And so we do a few things to just pull people out of the weeds and just get a swag. Like we don't need perfect, we don't need a perfect answer. We just need a reasonable answer in terms of the time frame. So the way that we get a reasonable answer is, first of all, we limit the options. So the options are over there on the right. Never down, 4 hours, 1 day, 3 days, 1 week, 3 weeks, 2 months. If people are only arguing about is it 1 day or 3 days, like that's where you can cut off the conversation. Be like, yep, okay, it's somewhere between there, got it. You know, 3 weeks and 2 months, like, does it really matter? You know, just we can pick one and move on. And the whole point of this conversation, first of all, is to see where the executives are at, because they generally know, like I've done this many times, and they all generally have a good sense of what the timeframes are. And when they don't, this is probably the more important thing, is when they disagree, it's always a great conversation. And so the second trick that we use to be able to facilitate this effectively is not only limiting the options, but getting everyone to vote at the same time. And the way that we do that is by handing out cards. We print out a set of cards with each of those, how many options are there? 7. Each of those 7 options, you know, 1 card per option. We get those 7 cards and we hand a set of 7 cards to everybody in the room. And so then we go through the products and services. We say, okay, adjudicate claims. Everyone pick a card. And once they all pick a card, great. Everyone show us your card. And then we just look at everyone around the room and what card they picked. And so one, you get 2 benefits out of this. One, you get very independent thinking. People have to pick a card without knowing what other people are saying. And then 2, you can quickly see, just by looking around the room, who's the high man, who's the low man, and are we roughly agreeing? And so then the only thing I tend to do is, if it's all in rough agreement, I just pick a number and put it down. And if it's if there's like a high man, low man type of thing, I say, great, you 2 talk for a minute. The high person and the low person talk, like, what's the right answer? And then the third thing that you could do is kind of fall back to you know, the expert, right? So each of these products and services probably has an expert in the room. You know, between the CFO and the CIO and the COO, they could probably speak to it and kind of defer to them, like, what's the right answer? So by doing that, you can cut through these time frames in like 10 minutes, sometimes maybe 15. You know, and the point is to move fast. Like, you just want to get people's perceptions and have the important conversations where people are way out of alignment. And again, by doing that, you no longer have to justify your downtime tolerances. They're justifying their downtime tolerances to themselves. And if they disagree, they're arguing about it amongst themselves. And so by the end of this, you end up with a list of timeframes that are pretty plausible that these guys buy into. Now, a few other things to note here. One is, sometimes people will answer what they're able to do, not what they need to do. And you want to get people out of that habit. You want to be asking them, like, what does the business need? Not, you know, what are you able to deliver today? You'll hear the CIO being like, well, we can't do never down because we don't have the systems for it. That's not the question we're asking. We're asking, what does the business need? We'll come back to you with what you can do, although thanks for the hint that your systems can't do it. So you want to answer this question for, what does the business really need? And again, as I said, when you get the executives in the room that can look across the business, they're pretty good typically at understanding kind of like the pain of the customer, the cost involved, and they can come up with an answer really quite fast that simplifies a ton of your program. So that's how much business continuity do we need. And the output of that is a list of these products and services, and everyone has a time frame next to them. That everyone in the steering committee can at least go, yep, seems reasonable to me. Oh, by the way, one other note on the products and services as you're building those. People will inevitably mention things like maintain facilities and collect supplies and things like that. And generally speaking, we try and exclude those. And the reason why is that what they're really doing is they're saying, well, we need facilities to be able to deliver these things. And your answer to that is, yep, I know. I'm going to figure out everything that you need to deliver these things and come back to you with an answer on that. But if I went to the facilities people and said, you know, what's your impact of downtime? They wouldn't know. They'd say, like, well, go ask the business. You know, so we want to start with the business things first and then work our way down into the dependency stack. So some of those kind of back office type support things we tend to keep out of products and services, knowing that they'll get pulled in as we identify dependencies and work through what's really needed to be able to deliver these products and services. All right, so that's how much business continuity do we need. The other footnote that goes with how much business continuity do we need is just a moment to talk about threats and vulnerabilities. So we tend to only sit on this slide long enough to get anything out on the table that the executives want to talk about. And what I mean by that is, you all are business continuity practitioners, and you know that we're going to build a business continuity program that is at least mostly threat agnostic, right? We all hazards planning and all those types of things. And so talking a ton about threats that they're worried about is typically not the most important thing, because you're going to build an all hazards plan. I say that, but at the same time, you know what? When you're in Florida, you want to talk about hurricanes, and when you're in San Francisco, you want to talk about earthquakes. You want to get those types of major threat issues that are on their minds out on the table, so that you are making sure that you've got an accounting for them. And then the same thing on the vulnerability side. Sometimes some of these steering committee members, they just have particular worries, like the CIO with his technology, that they just need some space to speak about them. And so this is the space. Let them talk about the vulnerabilities that they have and that they're worried about. Let them talk about the threats. This isn't the time for you to give a dissertation on everything that you know about all these things. It's to let them talk and get on the table, and to just know where they're at, so that as you do a business impact analysis, you can make sure that you're speaking to the things that they're particularly concerned about. So that's the footnote to question 3. And then we move to question 4. So question 4 is sometimes the easiest one and sometimes the hardest one. Rarely anything in between, honestly. So the thing with question 4 is, like, the question is, who should sponsor, lead, and participate in this program? And in most cases, you already know who the program manager is, because that tends to be you. In most cases, you have a steering committee, or at least the start of one, because you've gotten this group together. And then you've got the program sponsor. Again, in most cases, you have those things. So this slide is a time to raise up the basic question of, are these the right people to be able to drive this program the way that we need to? Like, we've just talked about why we need it. We've just talked about what we're trying to do. Do we have the right people in the room to be able to do that? Do we have the right program manager? Do we have the right program sponsor? And do we have the right steering committee? And like a good portion of the time, everyone's like, yep, we got it. This is the right people. We're good. That's when it's the easiest question. When it's the hardest question is when, quite frankly, you know that the program sponsor isn't the right person. If we just talked about all these critical business things and the program sponsor is the CIO, maybe they're not the right person. And this is the time to raise it and to ask the honest question, like, hey, we've got all these critical business things that we just identified, and the project sponsor is the CIO. Does that really make sense? Is he the right person to be able to drive this and engage the rest of the executive leadership team on? And if the group says yes, then you move on. But you've got to raise your concerns. And the same thing with the steering committee. Most often, it's that you have people missing from the steering committee that you want to bring in. But sometimes it's a question of the people in the room aren't the right people. And quite frankly, this is when, this is another one of those times where you got to speak up and raise that as a real issue, and talk through it. And talk through it from the spirit of, like, hey, look, we just identified all these important things. I want to just make sure that we've got the right people. And my concern is, when we talk about a finance role, if we don't have the CFO in the room, that finance decisions can't be made. Not that you're not great, as a controller, Bob, but it seems like when James, the CFO, isn't in the room, that we're not able to make decisions. So that's a concern for me. And so just raising those things up and seeing what the feedback is, having those open and honest conversations, this is the space for that, and to raise it. And so that's the 20% is when it becomes kind of the hardest conversation, because you have to kind of put out on the table that you've got to worry about, do we have the right people involved? Same thing for other program participants. Sometimes I'll put in a list of department coordinators and raise the same questions. If I think they're the wrong department coordinators, or they're at too low a level, or maybe they're too high a level and they don't have enough time, we'll put that all in there as well and have a conversation about it, and just to get people's feedback. So that's question 4. 4 questions that will create, quite frankly, laser focus around what your business continuity program is really needing to do. And once you've got that laser focus, then the question becomes, well, what do we do with it? So let's talk about what we do with it. So you might not be surprised to learn from the title of this presentation that the first thing you can do is kind of simplify a lot of the stuff that you're doing. So once you know exactly what products and services are most important and what timeframes they're important to be recovered in, the first thing you can do is a business impact analysis that greatly simplifies what you're doing with the BIA. So if you are doing a survey for a BIA, or if you're like sending out a spreadsheet for people to populate, you know, those types of things, this is the entree to allow you to stop doing that. Permission to stop sending those surveys out. It's also permission to worry less, not at all, but worry less about impacts. It, of course, is not permission to skip the BIA entirely, but Bob can attest, that's a whole different webinar that we can cover. You don't want to skip the BIA, but you can greatly simplify it. So here's how you simplify it. You make the BIA a mapping exercise. So you've got these products and services, and all you need to do in the BIA is to understand first what departments are involved in delivering those products and services, and second, what are the 5 types of, you know, what are the details of the 5 resources that they need to deliver them? And the 5 resources are facilities, people, suppliers, equipment, and technology. And so it becomes really just a mapping exercise. You can go and talk to the departments that are involved in delivering, adjudicating claims. That might be one department or it might be many. And you can talk to them about what do you really need to adjudicate claims? And they might say, well, what do you mean by adjudicate claims? You know, so then you have a conversation about what does it really mean to adjudicate claims? And then you capture just the resources that are needed to adjudicate claims. Now, particularly for my manufacturing clients, but also sometimes healthcare, when we talk about resources and mapping all of the things that are needed to deliver a product and service, you might be rolling your eyes quietly at your screen and going like, yeah, well, we've got 5,000 pieces of equipment that are involved in delivering this particular product. And my answer to that is, again, to simplify, don't try and capture every piece of equipment that's needed to deliver it, but maybe start by just capturing where the single points of failure are. Like where you have no alternatives, where there is, you know, one piece of equipment with no other backups, you know, those types of things. What are the high risk pieces that you want to capture? That's the other simplifying tool that you can use to kind of narrow the BIA down. And then finally, you know, I mentioned worrying less about impacts. The reason you can worry less about impacts is because the executives have already told you the time frame that they're tolerant of for these products and services. And so the default is to just align to what the executive said. Going out of that default, you might need to do one of 2 things. You might need to tell the executives that the time frame that they suggested is too aggressive and that you need to push it out. In which case you need to build a business case as to why the executives need to move their time frame out. Or they might, you might, as talking to departments, realize that the time frame that the executives indicated is not aggressive enough and that it needs moved in, that it needs to be recovered faster when you realize talking to the business. And so each of those, you need to build a business case where that's where you need the impacts and the details to be able to take back to the steering committee and say like, okay, you guys said 3 days, but the reality is this thing isn't gonna, you know, we're not gonna be in business after 3 days if this thing isn't running in the first day. And to be able to kind of give them that feedback so that they can have that argument, like is it 1 day or 3 days? So that's why you can't ignore impacts entirely, but you can certainly minimize them. And you know, if you're spending a lot of time trying to quantify impacts, like is it a 4, is it a 5, or is it $100,000 worth of downtime a day, you can typically end all of that. Stop all of it. They don't need it. They just set downtime tolerances by sitting in a room and looking at each other and knowing the answer. And they got to the same answer in most cases, like 80% of the time. So they don't need more justification, but in some cases you might need to go back and help them adjust their perspective, and that's where you need some impact data. Plans. Once you have a listing, a concrete listing of 10 to 15 products and services with timeframes associated with them, you can, and you do a BIA to map that into the departments, you know exactly which plans to focus on. And quite frankly, you know which plans to kill as well. Now, you might also wonder like, okay, but that marketing department, the marketing is nowhere to be found on any of my products and services list, but you know, marketing is people too, and they should have some kind of a plan to be able to respond to disruption so that they're just not lost and wandering around the parking lot wondering what to do all day. Yeah, totally. but that could probably be like a standardized plan for all non-in-scope departments, non-critical departments. Call tree list, basic procedures for, keeping track of people, and, alternatives like working from home, making the most out of those types of things. But that doesn't have to be your focus. Your focus obviously has to be on the most critical things. And then sure, making sure that people are accounted for, and some of that emergency response side of things as well. So this whole thing becomes the ticket to fewer plans. Now the challenge there is sometimes you have to like literally kill plans. You have to go in and say like, we're no longer supporting this plan for your department. We've identified it as not critical. Happy to help you as needed, but it's not going to be a focus, and it's not going to be part of our metrics and things like that. And so that's a conversation that you have to have, and the discipline that's needed to be able to say no, and say like, this is not our focus. We have to focus on the most important things first. So that's plans. And then the third place to apply and simplify, in some cases it's a simplification, but in other cases it's kind of a brand new thing. This, quite frankly, doing good products and services is the only way I know of to create real useful metrics that go beyond basic activities, right? So like when I say basic activities, the easiest metrics in the world are to capture things like, did I do a BIA? Is my plan signed off? Is my plan up to date? That type of thing. Did I do? The problem is that executives get so bored with did I do metrics, right? So like if the steering committee discussion that you're currently having is like, well, why is this division have only 80% plans approved versus this division that is 96% plans approved? I mean, quite frankly, it's just a boring discussion, right? And so like what inevitably happens is the guy with the division with the 80% like has to go and harass people, or maybe it's 30%, has to go and harass people. And there's a place for that. Like, it's not that it's not important that people update their plans. It is important, but at the executive level, the real metrics come from having products and services, and this is what you can do with them. So this is just an example, super dumbed down to fit on a PowerPoint and whatnot. But this is what you can do. So if you've got a product or service called Perform Customer Service or Perform Customer Support, and you've got a clear objective after you've done the BIA, figured out strategies, all that kind of stuff, that the downtime, our goal is no more than 4 hours downtime and a 90-second wait time, once you're back up and running. And our current capability as estimated is like 8 hours and probably a 4-minute wait time of recovery because of capacity concerns. You can assign, first of all, like a color code to that, like red, yellow, green type of thing. And then, this is the perfect thing to engage executives on, to be like, okay, well, is that acceptable? And why is that the case? And what can we do about it? And so, like I said, this is the types of metrics, like how many of these products and services are green to the requirements that we've identified. And I'm talking about green across everything: facilities, technology, people, equipment, the whole thing. How many have gotten to that green level? Maybe not a lot initially, but you can kind of chip away at it. And so the discussion from these metrics becomes like, okay, well, what can we do in the next 6 months that moves us closer to that? Or should we change our expectations and accept more risk? Like, these are great conversations that that executives love having. Like, they light up to be able to have that type of a conversation. But the only way that you can get to a high enough level for them, as well as a real enough, right? So like high level means not dealing with like just one department or one system. And then real enough means like performing customer support, like that's a real thing that everyone can picture. And so it's not theoretical, it's very practical. And once you get to that place where it's high level and practical, executives love it. And as I said, I am not familiar, like if you are familiar with another way of getting to that type of a conversation, getting that high level of a set of metrics that employees can engage in or executives can engage in, send me an email. My email's at the end of the presentation because I've never seen it. And so that's why it's so important. So that's simplifying based on the focus. We're getting ready to land this thing, and I'll make sure we leave some time for questions. But I just want to pause there and mention that what we found is that the magic in this approach is that it solves for so many problems. It solves, go back to the list that we started with: too many plans, executives not engaged, everything is critical. quite frankly, it solves for all of them with about 90 minutes of time from your executives. And when I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that I love problem solving, this is the magic that I dream about. Like when we do one thing that makes other problems evaporate, they just go away, they just disappear. We never did anything about them, they just stop occurring. How magical is that? Like that's the best thing ever as far as I'm concerned. And so what we've done, I just want to zoom out a little bit to kind of broaden the picture for you. So we've talked about Frame today and how to apply it and simplify your program. What we've actually found is, as we've looked across all the different business continuity programs that we've helped, is that there are actually 6 different core root causes of problems that organizations struggle with business continuity around. So Frame is just the first one. Frame is the first and arguably the most critical root cause. If you don't have a clear frame, if you're not clear about the scope of your program, everything else is going to struggle. But there are 5 others that I'm not going to get into today because I don't have the time. But there are 5 others that are also root causes of the underlying struggles of business continuity programs. And we found that if you strengthen these things, many of the other problems that you have, well, they disappear. They just stop happening. And so what we've built is a series of tools like the frame discussion that I just presented to you that target each of these 6 areas to strengthen them for business continuity programs. And so that's the core of what we do at Avalution, is we build kind of tools that bring each of these 6 areas up. So we've got those tools, and then the other thing that we have is a process that introduces those tools at the appropriate timeframes and in the appropriate order to be able to kind of build momentum. I've got that blurred out initially, intentionally, because again, I don't have the time and that's not the point of this conversation. But I just want to explain to you that there's a bigger piece to this whole thing, that it's not just this one thing around frame, but there are a whole series of tools that can help strengthen some of the root causes and make the other stuff go away. But I would absolutely start with frame and use some of the tools that we've identified. If you'd like to go deeper into that side of the world and what some of these underlying root causes are and how to strengthen them for your program, we have built a self-assessment tool that's like a maturity model, if you will, around these 6 topics. And it's like, quite frankly, it's the world's simplest self-assessment tool. It is literally 20 questions, and it takes you like, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes if you're methodical, to be able to go answer 20 questions, and gives you a snapshot of kind of areas to focus on for your program and what some of the root causes might be that are limiting the success of your program and, quite frankly, limiting your happiness. Like, wouldn't it be more fun to do business continuity if people showed up to your meetings wanting to have a conversation? And so you can hit the link. Well, you can't literally hit the link, but if you type in bit.ly/BCOS check into your browser or your phone, it's super mobile friendly. You can go and take it. And if you send me an email after, I can send it to you as well. I don't think we do like kind of broadcast type follow-ups, but that's a tool that's out there and available that might help illuminate for your program, just kind of where you're at. The other way that you can use that tool, by the way, is to get other people's feedback, right? So it's a super easy questionnaire. Send it to your steering committee member, or send it to your most important coordinators and have them both take it and see what they say about your program, and kind of compare the answers. And those types of things are just a great way to kind of get out on the same page. Like, it's the world's easiest way to assess your program. And so I would encourage you to check that out. Okay, Bob, I've landed it with 6 minutes left for open questions. I'll put my contact information up on the screen here in case people want to reach out to me, which I'm happy to do, or shoot me an email. But if we've got questions that have come up throughout, Bob, you can lay them on me and we can try and cover them now.
All right, wonderful. And again, if you do have any questions for Rob, you can reach out directly to him via the email there, or utilize the question panel on the right-hand side. We'll get to as many as we can here today. First question, for risks and threats, I also include active shooter events, which would be a major issue for employees in HR, could be cause for declaring a disaster. Do you view this as more a security or BC event?
Well, first of all, I think it depends on what you have in place at the company. I think it's a totally plausible addition as a threat. to that section where we're talking about threats. If you've got a good security group in place, or a good facilities group that can handle it, like my perspective on active shooter is that it always starts out as a security issue. It always starts out as an emergency response issue, depending on if emergency response is part of your scope or not. Some people it is, some people it's not. But it's going to eventually turn into a business continuity issue, right? So if there's an active shooter, it's going to be an emergency response issue to get people safe, but then eventually you're going to be kicked out of your building, and the police are going to control your building until they stop making it a crime scene. And so when that starts happening, it becomes a business continuity issue. So to me, it's definitely relevant to keep in place. How deep you go into it is probably more a matter of the scope of your program and to what degree you're responsible for emergency response. Because if you are responsible for emergency response and those types of safety things, then you obviously have to have some pieces in place to be prepared for that.
All right, if your organization has plans for all departments that contain all their critical functions and resources, you suggest should simplify and determine the, say, top 10 critical functions and only have plans for those. How do you plan for resources departments not in the top 10 need?
Yeah, so if possible, I would try to avoid kind of an arbitrary cutoff of the top 10, but I think what you'll find is that there's a natural progression, right? So if you end up with 10 critical products and services, great. If you end up with 15, that's fine too. If you have 30 and you need to figure out what are the most important of those, well, one, I would suggest that you probably need to relook at your products and services because most organizations don't need 30. But if the question is about well, what about all the other resources? I guess the answer I would give, at the risk of being a little bit cold, is that I would probably ignore them mostly, at least until I've got my arms squarely around the most important resources. The other thing you could do that's a little bit less cold than just totally ignoring them, would be to, in an ad hoc way, try and enable them, right? Like not spend a bunch of time trying to analyze or things like that, but helping the owners of those resources be aware that they, might have single points of failure, think about things that they could do, kind of empower the rest of the organization to pursue them, and allow your scope to be laser focused on the things that are going to literally make or break the organization. I think that goes into the question of there's a lot of wisdom in being able to say no. And I think that's pretty hard sometimes for especially for business continuity people, because I mean, quite frankly, half the time we're just waiting for somebody to involve us in things, right? Like we want people to involve us, and we feel some validation when people ask us about some of those things. But at the end of the day, I think what's more important than that is to keep the main thing the main thing. And if you've got clarity from your executives about what the main thing is, then I think implicit in that is permission to ignore the non-main things. And maybe it's not implicit. Maybe you need to get explicit with the steering committee about it.
All right, one more question here. You mentioned that the folks in the room might not know the answers that needed. Any suggestions on how to get those folks into the room?
So I've found that if you get the right folks, like CIO, COO, CFO types in the room, or even maybe one level below, they almost always have at least a answer. If you know that they pregame it a little bit, right? When you do your first walkthrough, if you've got these deep questions about the supply chain side, like I'm working with a retailer right now, and supply chain is huge for them because they're a retailer, right? So getting their products to their stores is super important. Then you might want to proactively get somebody from supply chain, like the VP of supply chain, into the room. If the CFO isn't as great with that piece of the coin, or the COO isn't as great with that piece of the coin. So you definitely have to plan ahead and kind of think about it a little bit, but generally speaking, the people that show up, they tend to have opinions and they'll share them. And they tend to be pretty right. Like you'd be surprised how even if they're not super informed, they can shoot pretty close to the target, I think.
All right, well, there's several questions we did not get to here today. If we did not get to your question, Rob will have access to all these questions, and we'll follow up with everyone after the webinar has ended. So any parting words here today, Rob?
No, just I thank you, Bob, and to DRJ for having us, and thank you all for attending. I really appreciate the time.
All right, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Rob for his time here today, as well as Avalution for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view that recording as frequently as you wish or share with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.